I'm going to be talking as a social psychologist today, and what I'm going to be talking about today is basically starting with some simple facts about exclusion and inclusion, and then trying to challenge some of the conventional wisdom. So first of all, what I want to argue is, and there shouldn't be much argument, social inclusion is essential to equality. Second of all, discrimination is systematic exclusion in terms of psychological as well as material exclusion, and that's bad. And third, that exclusion socially causes neuroscientifically some of the same kinds of responses that physical pain causes. So that this kind of inclusion is a real phenomenon. Now, at the same time, what I want to argue today in terms of challenging conventional wisdom is this. Although exclusion is the problem, inclusion doesn't necessarily have to be a solution. I want to go one step further and argue that superficial inclusion can be a problem. And it can be a problem because it cloaks injustice. So what I'm going to talk about today will be sort of subtle contemporary bias and how it occurs in indirect ways and rationalizable ways. How inclusion in terms of superficial commonality seems like a solution, but it actually contributes to the problem. And then I'll talk very briefly about implications and interventions. Now, as I go through this, I want to sort of apologize for a number of things at the beginning after I've listened to everybody's talks. First of all, I'm going to go back and forth between racism and sexism as examples. And I want to assure you I know the difference. And I recognize that there are fundamental differences between racism and sexism, but I'm going to try to draw the parallels so we can look at convergent processes in both to get an understanding of how contemporary biases operate. Second of all, my talk was originally going to be about intersectionality, but as I wrote it, it turned out it's not about intersectionality. So I want to say I recognize the importance of intersectionality, and if you want another 20-minute talk from me, I'll give you that talk. But for this case, I'm really going to be talking about racism and sexism in parallel. In addition, when I talk about racism, I'm going to talk about black-white relations. And again, I've written papers on this, that black-white paradigm is not the best example of all sorts of prejudices, that Latino Anglo prejudice is very different, but I only have 20 minutes, so I'm going to be simplifying this. And finally, I want to say that as a social psychologist, I'm going to be oversimplifying things. I'm going to be decontextualizing things because I think that as a social psychologist, what we offer that complements what so many people in this room do is the precision of being able to look at processes in a decontextualized way to understand how these things operate and then try to bring them back into the real world and back again to the laboratory. So I'm not going to apologize for being a social psychologist. That's where I'm going to draw the line. And when I talk about these processes, I'm just going to rely on a large body of research on the difference between explicit and implicit attitudes. I'm not going to be talking directly about that research, but much of the work in social psychology is distinguished between explicit attitudes, which are the attitudes that people profess, they're very deliberative, and they're the conscious attitudes that we have. And then the work of Mazu Banaji and others on implicit attitudes, which are automatically activated attitudes that we're often unconscious about, that we even possess them. And what's interesting about that research is that explicit and implicit biases are only weakly correlated with one another. And the reason for that is this, that if you look at both racism and sexism, there's a small proportion of our population who are overtly racist and sexist, and they have implicit biases. There's a small proportion of the American society that says they're not prejudiced and they're not sexist in any way and don't have any implicit biases towards women or towards people of color. But the majority of white Americans fall into the category of being off diagonal. They're people who say they're not prejudiced, who believe they're not prejudiced, but who have these implicit biases. And about 80% of white Americans will say they're not sexist, or they're not racist, but work with the IAT will show that about 60 to 75% of the population are both racist and sexist at an implicit level. And it's this kind of this dissociation between explicit and implicit attitudes that we argue forms the basis of contemporary racism and sexism. And the simple sort of presentation of this is that what we argue is that when situations about where appropriate behavior is clear, where the right response is unambiguous, most people will rely on the explicit attitudes because they understand what needs to be done, and they'll draw upon those explicit attitudes and behave in an unbiased fashion. However, given that the majority of white Americans are implicitly biased, these implicit biases are sort of like a first step in terms of a direction of being biased and discriminating, but people will only discriminate when they don't know enough to put the brakes on their discrimination and make the correction to be consistent with their explicit attitudes. And so what we argue is when situations are ambiguous, when right and wrong is not clearly defined, where appropriate behavior is not clearly defined, or where you can justify a negative response towards a woman or a person of color on the basis of some factor other than race or gender, that's when these implicit biases will be expressed, but they get expressed in ways that people can justify or rationalize, so they never have to confront the possibility that they're racially or sexually motivated in terms of being biased. Does that make sense to people? So I'm going to give you a couple of studies and then bring in additional research. I'm going to talk about some of the work we've done on race, and then talk about parallel work on gender and sexism. Here's a simple study we did a number of years ago. What we did was, in 1989, we ran this study where we asked college students to help us make an employment decision for one of the most prestigious positions on campus that an undergraduate could have. What they did was they evaluated an applicant. Subjects were white, and the applicant had impeccably strong qualifications or had moderate qualifications, a mixture of positive and negative qualifications. And we simply asked them to make some recommendations about what we should do and told them that their input would be consequential in the final decision. What we find here is when the applicant is black, and we vary simply the race of the person by the photograph, when the applicant was black relative to white, there was no bias against the applicant when they had impeccably strong qualifications. Because the decision about what to do there was obvious. You couldn't make any other decision but that. But when people were confronted with an applicant who had mixed qualifications, who had moderate qualifications, that's when we get significant bias against the black relative to the white applicant. What I want you to see here is that people are really giving the white applicant almost a benefit of the doubt, that there isn't that much different between a white applicant who's impeccably qualified and a white applicant who is pretty well qualified. But the black applicant doesn't get that same benefit of the doubt. We replicated this study with another group of students 10 years later, and what we find is exactly the same pattern of results. What's interesting is from 1989 to 1999, explicit racism declined. That is, reports of being prejudiced declined significantly. Obvious racism and blatant racism isn't there anymore very much, but the subtle racism, because people don't recognize it and don't correct for it, occurs at basically the same pattern 10 years later. And then we also did a conceptual replication of this, not with college students, but with human resource professionals in Puerto Rico. And we get exactly the same pattern of results. You can see that when someone's impeccably qualified, there's no bias, but when there's that mixture of qualifications, the bias emerges, but in a way that people can justify or rationalize on the basis of some factor other than race. Now, the way this turns out that it operates is that what happens is when people get the mixed qualifications, what they do is they tend to weigh the qualifications differently depending upon the race, and I'll say in a minute, the sex of the applicant. So for example, what we've done in some studies was we asked people to make admissions decisions. And we gave them an applicant who was extremely strong in terms of standardized test scores, SATs, and extremely strong in terms of high school record, GPA. Those people, no discrimination based on race. But when we gave people a mixture, someone who was high on one and low on the other, what happened is that's when we get discrimination against the black applicant. Human and Cohen have found that's when you get discrimination against a female applicant for a position. But what happens is when you ask people what's the most important qualification predicting success in college, what they do is they tend to say that the most effective, the most important qualification is the criteria that the white person happens to be strong in and what the black person happens to be weakest in. So what they do is they shift their judgment about what's important to justify the way they make their decision. And in that way, discrimination gets expressed, but in a way you can justify or rationalize. Ewan and Cohen have found that this operates the same way with gender bias against women in employment. They've also found out some other things that's interesting. The more objective people feel they are in making the decision, the more they can point to objective qualifications, the more likely they are to engage in this bias. That by feeling objective, it actually frees you to discriminate a little bit more because it's not you. You take down your guard and you're able to discriminate more. Benoit Monin and others have found, for example, if people can make an egalitarian act right before, they're more likely to engage in subtle bias later because they've already liberated themselves from feeling that they could be biased. That relaxes the motivation to be guarded, and it creates more bias down the road. Does that make sense to people? Now, this idea of objectivity is particularly fascinating to me because not only will people engage in subtle bias, but if you can really talk about being objective, you will never even realize that you are being biased because you can always point to numbers that will somehow make this work. And I think that has tremendous implications when you start looking at disparities, for example, of women in STEM disciplines. STEM disciplines, science, technology, engineering, and math. I mean, those are disciplines that pride themselves in being objective. Those are also disciplines where there are vast disparities between the representation of women and minorities and white men in those particular occupation, in those particular fields. It's particularly fascinating, too, when you look at the literature about trying to explain these disparities. People are resistant to acknowledging that discrimination could be a problem. One of the common arguments has been differences in the genetic ability of women and men in these fields. That has been refuted, at least to me, pretty convincingly. Other people have argued that it could be that women don't have a sense of belongingness. There's cues of exclusion in these fields, and that leads them to make different career decisions. I think that's very plausible. But people have taken that argument to say that is the reason and discrimination is not a problem. I don't believe that. Of course, racism and sexism are my business, so I'm going to say it's going to be hard to convince me that that isn't the case. But what we want to argue is in these fields that discrimination probably is a real issue. So, I was doing some focus groups with science chairs at a major research institution with Joe Handelsman. And it was a fascinating experience because we would show them all the disparities in their departments of majors, graduate students, graduation rates. We could give all these people all the objective facts in the world, and they would deny that discrimination or bias could have anything to do with that process. They were quick, it was fascinating, all the different explanations they could come up with. They were all these different justifications, but justifications that they could attach numbers to in some way. And that feeling of being objective allowed them to just talk in sexist ways without them realizing it. And as we had these discussions, all I kept thinking was, can you fit any more white men into this room? Isn't that going to be a cue for you that something is wrong, that everybody in this room is a white male? They denied it. So one of the things we did to try to convince people of this with Corinne Moss-Verkruzen, Tori Breskel, and others, is that we ran a straightforward audit study. And the simple thing that we did was that applicants were applying for a job as a lab manager with science faculty and major research institutions. All we did was we varied the gender of the applicant, and the applicant had, I think, very strong qualifications, but not impeccable. What we then did was we simply asked the science faculty, what would you do? Would you hire this person? How much would you invest in career mentoring for this person? How competent is the person? And what we found among these very objective people was, of course, bias. And what you find there is that they were significantly less likely to hire the woman relative to the man, who have exactly the same qualifications. Of course, they didn't know that. There were different participants. They were much more willing to mentor a man in that field than a woman in that field. And even though we knew that the resume and all the material on it were the same, they tended to see that they saw the woman as less competent. And in fact, those perceptions of less competence is what led to them, that mediated the effect in terms of less hireability and some of the other effects. So objective people who are quick to deny that they're biased are really susceptible to these subtle biases. And again, what we do is we cloak our discrimination in objectivity, distance, in a way that doesn't implicate us because we're all good people. And that's the danger of this. The good people doing good things can engage in biases and perpetuate biases. So now we get the problem. What can we do about it? So Sam Gartner and I thought, well, here's one solution. One solution would be the extent to which people judge people on the basis of their social category, race, or gender, is a problem. It evokes stereotypes automatically, and it's going to lead people to act in biased ways. The solution we had then was, rather than get people to think about us as members of different groups, what we would want to do is get people to think of themselves as members of a common group. And one of the nice things about social categorization is it's malleable. That you can think of yourself as men and women, or you could think of yourself as people at this conference. And if you think of yourself as people at this conference, then the differences are going to fade into the background, and we're all going to become more positive towards one another because we're all members of the same group. Makes sense. We found the good news is that that does a great job in terms of improving attitudes, but what I want to argue today is what seems like a good idea is not such a good idea. You know, I tell people this is one of my, my publishing tricks. I publish something for a number of years, and then I criticize it for a number of years. You double your publications. But here's the argument I want to make, and then try to show you this empirically, is that the extent to which we begin to think of ourselves as only members of one group, and we ignore group differences, it means we're going to be less sensitive to group-based disparities. Because the groups don't exist, we don't acknowledge that there are disparities and inequalities within our larger group. We apply the standards, the same standards to everybody, but whose standards get applied? It's the standards of the dominant group, and everybody gets judged by standards that benefit members of the dominant group. So what happens is when you create this sort of common identity, it obscures inequalities and unfairness among different subgroups, and in a way that undermines any recognition that that would impel people to action to create equality. And what I want to argue one step further is dominant groups strategically use superficial commonality to maintain the status quo and the stability of their advantage. And so I'm going to give you a true social psychological experiment that takes it out of reality, but then I'm going to come back and bring it into issues of race and sexism. In this study, what we did was we tried to bring subjects into the lab in something that was realistically important to them in terms of power. We used undergraduates, and the reason undergraduates participate in studies is that they do it to gain research credits. So what we did in the study, we had 2 3-person groups. What we did was one 3-person group was randomly assigned to the position of responsibility of distributing credits. So they had 10 credits to distribute across 6 people. So they're the high-power group. The low-power group was given 10 marbles, which are meaningless, and said, you get to distribute 10 marbles just to keep them busy, okay? So you have a high-power and you have a low-power group. Then what we did was we simply asked the groups to interact with one another. And what we imposed on the groups was what they got to talk about. In one case, they could only talk about commonalities. What it's like to be a college student, what it's like to be in this experiment, what it's like to live in this town. All things that are sort of what I would call superficial commonalities. In the other condition, what they got to talk about was the things that distinguished them and made them different in this experiment. And of course, that is one group has advantage and the other group has disadvantage. So those are the 2 conditions. And then what we measured was the attitudes of the groups towards one another, intergroup attitudes, but we also looked at the expectations, and then we looked at the behaviors in terms of how the groups actually behaved. Here's what we found. In terms of attitudes, when people talk about commonality versus differences, both groups are happier when they talk about commonality and like the other group better. So the advantage group likes it better, likes the other group, disadvantaged group members better when you talk about commonalities and differences. And interestingly, the minority group, the disadvantaged group, also likes the advantaged group better when they talk about commonalities. Commonalities makes us happy. It's harmony. It brings us together. It creates common ground. The second aspect of this is that we asked members in the disadvantaged group, how fair do you think the advantage group is going to be in terms of distributing the credits. And I'll just walk you through this. When they had been engaged in a commonality discussion versus a difference discussion, members of the disadvantaged group liked the advantage group more. What's also interesting is that they paid less attention to the inequality of the situation. Because once you become included in that group, you are no longer a member of that other subgroup. And so they pay less attention to the fact that their group is disadvantaged. The more they like the other group, the less attention they pay to the inequality of the situation, the more they expect the other group to be benevolent. Makes sense, right? We just had a good conversation, everybody's happy, people will treat me well. So then what we did was we looked at the actual allocation of credit. So remember, 5 credits would be true equality in this situation. So remember, the disadvantaged group, if you ask them how many credits do you think you would actually receive out of 10, they expected to receive almost 5 in the commonality condition, because didn't we just get along? But they expected when we didn't get along to only receive about 3.5 credits. Okay? They expected the other group to be fair with commonalities, unfair when things didn't go well. When you look at the advantage group in terms of how many credits they actually allocated, when you look at the differences condition, they were biased. Okay? The disadvantaged group got exactly what it expected. They didn't expect much, they didn't get much. But what do you think happens in the common condition? With the argument being this, the goal of the advantage group is to create harmony, to create a sense of oneness, to create a sense of belonging and inclusion. But once you create that belongingness and inclusion, your job is done. Right? You have now able to create solidarity. You're able to create a sense of coherence and cohesion among the group, and everybody is happy. And if everybody is happy, is there any reason for you to give up your resources to the other group? No, social change occurs when people are unhappy. It doesn't occur when people are happy. Okay? It's that simple. Okay? And in fact, what you find is in black-white interactions, the goal of majority group, of whites, in intergroup interactions is to be liked. And once they're liked, the job is done, because everybody is now stable and things are back to normal. People of color want to be respected, and so they have very different needs. Now, what I want to say is you can take this and let's just apply this to a whole range of different situations. And I'm just going to quickly summarize a number of different studies that we've done where we've manipulated a sense of commonality versus difference in many different ways and looked at the outcomes of that. And we're going to do it first of all for advantage groups. And the advantage groups we've typically looked at so far have been white Americans compared to black Americans, dominant ethnic groups in other countries. But in terms of this, the majority group members, when they have a sense of commonality, when you emphasize that commonality in interactions with another group, they're less likely to perceive group-based disparities. They don't notice differences based on groupness. Second of all, when they do recognize disparities, they see them less as unfair, because they see the collective system as being fairer and more justified. And so once you think of yourself as a collective, you're motivated to justify that group's operation. And third, the majority group is less likely to act to achieve equality in those situations. So if they don't recognize injustice, they will not act to change the system to be more fair. This is particularly important to me because so much work in terms of creating equality puts the burden on minority group members, on low power group members. We have some research to show that when high power group members recognize injustice, they will take action because injustice is the fabric of human society. Right? Justice is so important to what we do that injustice has to be combated. But if you put blinders on people where you don't see groups, then you don't see group-based injustices, and the majority group won't intervene. Let me just give you the women and minority groups that we have. What we find here is when you emphasize commonality, members of minority groups are less likely to think about their disadvantage. It just doesn't occur to them in the interactions. They're more likely to blame themselves for their failure rather than something external like discrimination. They're less likely to perceive prejudice. They're less likely to confront sexism. So in fact, we've got preliminary work here where what we do is we simply have a man in a chat room interacting with a woman. And in one condition now that we've just started, the man uses the word we and us a lot to create a sense of inclusiveness. And then the man makes an overtly sexist comment about somebody else. And we look whether the women confront. If the man creates a sense of we-ness with the woman, her likelihood of confronting sexism goes down dramatically to a minuscule amount. I think it may be that, in fact, if women are very much oriented towards sort of being communal, that keeping the integrity of the group is more important than confronting the sexism. But what that does is it co-opts the system, where sexism can go without being confronted. And finally, minority group members, when there's a sense of commonality, superficial commonality, are less likely to support collective action towards equality. So what happens is this becomes a clever ploy in order to co-opt members of disadvantaged groups to become partially included in the majority group. And it allows people to feel good, but what its ultimate outcome is doing is perpetuating inequality at a structural level, where nobody looks at it, nobody talks about it, and nobody addresses it. Now, so if that doesn't work, what else can we do? I'm just going to talk about one last intervention. And this is some work I did with the military a number of years ago. It was kind of interesting experience for me. I spent a lot of time staying away from the military, but when they started to pay me, you'd be surprised how much attention I'd give them. But what happened with the military, and Robert sort of talked about this. This was a little bit after the military had turned to an all-volunteer and away from the draft. It was still a number of years after that, but they were still trying to recruit to fill their quotas of what they needed. And what they realized is recruitment was going to have to recruit people of color and women in order to meet their needs. So they brought together a whole bunch of people to deal with the problem they had. And here's the problem. I'm going to talk about it for minority men, but the graphs for women compared to men are exactly the same. In all major branches of the military, for all the years they studied, women and people of color were promoted at rates lower than their representation in the promotion pool. And the military, you can only come up for promotion if you were, quote, in the zone, which means you had to be fully qualified for promotion even to get into the pool. And the second aspect of this is what Robert mentioned too, is if you look at the ranks as you go up, from captain to major to lieutenant colonel, the higher the status, the greater the disparity. And that occurs for women as well. You don't get much difference for colonels or generals because there are hardly any there. So this was the problem. And when we talked to the Deputy Secretary of the Army, we asked him a simple question. Well, what do you tell your promotion boards to do? And his answer at the time, this was the sitting Deputy Secretary, was a simple one. He said, what we tell people is we're all members of the Army. We all wear one uniform. So I want you, when you make your promotion decisions, to pay attention to the fact that we're all wearing the same uniform. So what he wanted people to do was to be race blind and to be gender blind in terms of making their decisions. Now, what I would argue is being race blind and gender blind frees people to be biased, right? Because they're not sensitive to the So what we suggested to the new deputy, don't be colorblind and gender blind, be color conscious and race conscious and simply be aware of it. And second of all, to combat unconscious racism, make people have to talk about it at a conscious level, make people accountable. So here's what the new Deputy Secretary of the Army said. He told all promotion boards this: I believe the women that are coming up for promotion are just as good as the men. I believe that the people of color coming up for promotion are just as good as the white applicants. That's my belief. And if you come up with disproportionate promotions, I want you to come in and tell me why. I want to hold you accountable. That was the entire manipulation, his entire intervention. Now, granted, the Army is much more hierarchical than our colleges, so people pay attention to that a lot more. But that was all they were told to do, is pay attention to race and gender. Take your assumption, maybe your implicit assumption about the inferiority of women and people of color. And let's make it the explicit assumption is they're just as good, because whenever people saw these disparities, they didn't think anything was wrong. They didn't think anything was wrong. Why? Because implicitly, it's exactly what they would expect. So what he said was, let's just change the implicit to explicit and let's see what happens. So here's what happened the first year after he did it. And I'm just going to show you the race, but again, gender is exactly the same. All the disparities disappeared. And this occurred for minorities, and it occurred for women. In addition, the Army did a study that never saw the light of day, but what they did was they tracked women and people of color who were promoted during this period and just looked at their trajectory. What they found is the trajectory of women and people of color promoted during this period were the same as white men. That is, this wasn't about lowering standards and just letting people in. It was about actually paying attention to the qualities that people had and opening a door that allowed them to go through the next door and the next door and the next door. In the second year that they did this, this was the result they got. The third year, this was the result they got. 3 years in a row. Deputy secretaries of the Army serve how many years? 3. The next deputy secretary came in and changed the rule. He did not have the same guidelines to the promotion. What do you think you got? All of a sudden, you can't find the qualified minorities and you can't find the qualified women. That when you let people go back to cloaking their injustices by their belief that they're fair or by paying attention only to the commonalities, it allows these things to occur in a way that people don't recognize, can't be combated, and is justified where good people are doing bad things. So I'm going to come to my conclusion here. Contemporary bias is subtle and unconscious. I want you to recognize the irony of harmony. Again, if you look at work on social change comes through social unrest. It comes through the recognition of fairness. And the fact that we often try to smooth things over has a differential benefits for disadvantaged groups and advantaged groups. That harmony is a way of solidifying and cementing the status quo and co-opting minority groups. And it reduces the likelihood of real change, where people will say one thing, but when it actually comes to implementation, you get a disconnect. And finally, interventions. I would say that you can't rely on good intentions. If most of bias is unconscious, we can't rely on people having good intentions to get rid of bias, because we're not aware of the biases that we have. That we have to be group conscious, not group blind to gender or race. And finally, I think this is heresy for a social psychologist to say that we can't simply intervene at the individual level, but we have to think of these kind of structural interventions that change the rules of the game. And individuals will then comply with the new rules and do the right thing because they want to be good. But as long as we do the same things the way we've always done it, all we can expect is the same results we've always gotten. So I'll stop there. Thank you.